I'm Bonna Betcher, Director of Olin and Uris Libraries, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Olin Book Talk of the semester. Before introducing Professor Baptist, I have some general information to share with you. We have a strong roster of book talks this semester, and if you happen to miss one, recordings can be found on the Olin and Uris Libraries website, along with information about other upcoming events and exhibitions. Our next Olin Library Book Talk is scheduled for Tuesday, February 23rd, when Alicia Cohn, Assistant Professor of English, will discuss her new book, Still Life, Suspended Development in the Victorian Novel. It concerns Victorian novelists' fascination with states of trance and sleep, moments of diminished consciousness. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of today's featured book, we have a few copies in the back, and Lynn will be glad to assist you. Professor Baptist will be happy to sign a purchased copy for you. Help yourself to refreshments anytime, and if you would like to receive announcements about library-sponsored events, please add your name to the clipboard. Now, today we are honored to welcome Professor Edward Baptist, who will discuss his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, published by Basic Books in September 2014. Professor Baptist joined Cornell's Department of History in 2003 after several years as the Charlton W. Tebow Assistant Professor of History at the University of Miami. He is the author of a number of books and has edited or co-edited numerous others, including American Capitalism, A Reader, New Studies in the History of American Slavery, and Creating an Old South, Middle Florida's Plantation Frontier Before the Civil War, which won the Rembert Patrick Award from the Florida Historical Society for the best book on Florida history in 2002. He is currently working on a revised edition of New Studies in the History of American Slavery and Slavery and Capitalism in the 19th Century, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States, which is an English translation of Escrividão e Capitalismo Histórico no Século XIX, co-edited with Rafael Marchesi and Ricardo Salas, and has begun research for Fugitive Traces, How Runaways Ended Slavery and Created the Modern United States. In addition to articles for academic journals such as the Journal of Southern History, American Historical Review, and the Journal of American History, he has contributed a host of essays to edited collections such as the forthcoming The Whipping Machine for Capitalism, Slavery, and Toxic Debt, Liar Loans, Collateralized and Securitized Human Beings and the Panic of 1837 for Capitalism Takes Command, edited by Michael Zakim and Robert Wright, just to give two examples from the many he has contributed to scholarship on American social and economic history. A spokesman for and practitioner of the digital humanities, Professor Baptist is the project leader and primary curator for Freedom on the Move, a digital project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities that will present a database of information about fugitives from North American slavery. A sought-after speaker, Professor Baptist has presented more than 70 conference papers and invited lectures since 1995. And on campus, Professor Baptist has been House Professor and Dean of Carl Becker House since 2011. It is no surprise to learn that such an active scholar is himself the product of a research environment. His mother was a librarian. Today, we are fortunate to learn about Professor Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, which has been awarded the 2015 Hillman Prize for Book Journalism and the Organization of American Historians 2015 Avery O'Craven Award. This work has made a seminal contribution to the study of the economics of slavery and has refocused attention, both within and outside of academia, on the institution of slavery, the troubling economic innovations it engendered, and the generations of suffering it has spawned. Please join me in welcoming Professor Baptist.
Thanks. I think the microphone is it working now? Is it good? Does it sound good? Okay. I have to shorten the amount of information I provide, although since we're in the library, one can always look things up and find more. But it is good to be speaking here. I spent a lot of time in Olin and in Kroc doing the research for this book that I'll talk about today. And it just would not have been possible without the work of the folks who work here, without their, not just their technical support, but the moral support. Coming into the library and seeing people who work here every day, making sure that it's an environment for scholars and students to work in and to be successful in is really something that I think maybe scholars, well, perhaps scholars don't talk enough about the sort of moral example that provides and the encouragement that work provides. It pushes you to do your best, I think. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to talk here today because of that. All right, let me start with a story. See if I can get this to advance. And this story begins in Attala County, Mississippi, which you see outlined in red there, in 1833. That's when a man named Charles Thompson was born. And he didn't know it at the time, of course. He was just an infant. But he was born on a double frontier, a chronological one and a geographical one. So geographically, Attala was the edge of cotton country. And in Mississippi, cotton country actually marched inland from the Mississippi River. In fact, in 1833, that was a very significant year, one of several years in which big efforts were being made to push the Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians out of the remaining 40% of Mississippi, which was mostly northeast from there, which the original owners of Mississippi still held on to. Andrew Jackson's administration was working hard to make this happen. But Charles was also born on a chronological frontier. By 1833, the year of his birth, the commercial production of cotton had been driving American expansion into the Mississippi Valley for 40 years. And the drive was, at that point, accelerating. American cotton had already come from nowhere, less than 1% of all world cotton production in 1790, to dominate the world market for cotton. And by the 1830s, its share of the British cotton market, which was the most important one in the world, would rise to 80% or higher. And that was a growing market, which makes the increasing American dominance all that more impressive. The commodity market for cotton was growing just as fast as the industrial textile sector that cotton fed. And cotton came from the fields that Charles Thompson was destined to toil in. This is a chronological frontier in an even bigger scale than just the history of cotton itself. After 9,000 years of slow growth subsistence agricultural economics, in 1833, society's ability to produce goods and services was clearly beginning, at least in Western Europe and North America, to increase rapidly. People knew they were in the midst of a historical transformation. And looking back, we know very well that 19th century industrialization began with cotton textiles. Inventors in Britain had created new machines that could spin and weave cotton into cloth. Cloth was always one of the most important trade goods in any human society. And these machines could do it faster than ever, and they could do it a little bit faster each year. And as a result of this process of industrialization, the entire world was changing. As a factory system emerged, raw cotton became the most in-demand commodity on the world market. Southern enslavers had been able to seize control over that market. Of course, if cotton entrepreneurs could not continue to supply the ever-growing demand for that commodity in ever greater quantity, it was possible that prices would rise and the commodity would in turn become a cord that would choke off growth. So as Charles Thompson came into the world, dynamic systems that were changing rapidly, we're already churning, we're already growing, we're already transforming the world around him. And the changes were the classic shifts that have made the external world of modern social and political and economic history. We've been trying to explain them ever since. We've been even trying to explain capitalist modernity's effects on the internal world as well, in the form of cultural history's attempts to interpret a world in which all that is solid melts into air. All these things were underway, and now in the 1930s, change was already accelerating to an even faster, sustained pace measurable in both increased growth rates. In the 1830s, we first see, many would argue, modern growth rates of 2% or higher that can be sustained. And the momentum of these changes perhaps extends all the way through history to the present. Political and financial innovation was about to feed vast new amounts of credit, tens of thousands of enslaved laborers, into the ever-widening cotton fields of Mississippi. 1833 was also the year when Andrew Jackson began to destroy the Second Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve-like regulator on the American financial economy. And this would unleash state-chartered banks, and they in turn would unleash a bewildering array of financial schemes on the world credit market. These schemes, by the way, often use enslaved bodies as collateral for financial instruments that enabled people in distant cities like London and Amsterdam and New York to invest in the expansion of slavery, while allowing enslavers to borrow more rapidly and to expand the amount of human collateral they held, which led to still more borrowing and buying, of course, in a frenzy familiar to those of us who remember the last decade of financial expansion in the U.S. As a result, back in the 1830s, on the bleeding edge of capitalist expansion, U.S. enslavers would be able in that decade alone to move 250,000 enslaved people from older states like Maryland and North Carolina to new cotton frontiers like Attala County, just during that decade. And by 1837, compared to 1830, that process would have in turn helped to double America's U.S. production of cotton, again, the world's most widely traded commodity. Now, this expansion swelled into a bubble in slave prices, land prices, bond prices, and implicitly a giant bet on the future price of cotton. And eventually, that bubble burst. But as we know, booms and busts shape history, and personal histories too. Thompson recalled in his 1872 account of his own history, an autobiography that was one of more than 100 such accounts published by survivors of enslavement, published during the 19th century, that as the dust of the 1830s cotton and credit boom and bust cycle began to settle, the stability of his own young life was also compromised. His enslaver died, and the estate was reckoned as bankrupt. This is always a dangerous moment for people who were accounted themselves as liquid wealth. 20% of all the wealth in the United States, in fact, in the 1830s, was enslaved human beings. 6 heirs who had their own debtors to satisfy split up the Attala property's enslaved families, sending Charles, his father, and his mother to 3 different places. Moved to one new property in Pontotoc, Mississippi, which was even further into territory that by this point, the early 1840s, had been taken from the Chickasaw. Charles found himself at another key crossroad, one of the key crossroads in any enslaved person's life on the cotton frontier. And that was the first moment he went into a cotton field to work. For young or old, born in Mississippi or forced migrant from the old states, the moment when you stepped into the broken dirt of the cotton field was a moment when you learned things that perhaps you had heard but didn't really know from experience about what it was to be enslaved. People brought from the old states consistently reported that work was more intense in the new ones, the whip that was used was bigger and cut more deeply, and that enslavers deployed it more readily. Charles Thompson, of course, was born in Mississippi, not Virginia, so he didn't have that point of comparison. But just like forced migrants, as a 10 or 11-year-old, he still had to learn new things. And the thing that was always new was that he would never be able to stop learning, or in some ways we might say to stop inventing. And let me explain what I mean by that. Everybody knows about the cotton gin, of course, invented, we're told in 1791, invented, we are told, by Eli Whitney, although it is likely that he assembled it from inventions that were actually carried out by enslaved craftsmen. But he got his name on the patent. But once that bottleneck is taken out of the production process for raw cotton, so the cotton gin pulls out the seeds from the fibers, once that bottleneck is taken out, the bottleneck that remains is the process of picking. People could consistently grow, could plant, cultivate, bring to the point of harvest more cotton than they could actually harvest. So enslavers, Thompson found, pushed enslaved people to pick as fast as they could, relentlessly trying to push through that picking bottleneck. To pick as fast as they could all day long. Let's see. This, by the way, is Charles Thompson's autobiography. And here's a photo from the WPA narratives, or the Federal Writers Project, of an interviewee. This is our other big source for what life was like in the cotton picking season. Interviews done in the 1930s with survivors of slavery. Here we see the spread of cotton. I will come back to that, but this is what I'm looking for. This is one of our earliest known photos of cotton picking from the 1860s. And we don't know if these folks were free or enslaved. But enslaved people in the cotton fields were pushed to pick all day long until dusk fell. And then they carried their cotton back to a central point on the slave labor camp where they worked, and it was weighed. It was weighed. And then the numbers were written down. The weights each person had made during the day were written down on a slate and often would be transferred to a ledger like this. And I always tell people this is essentially a 19th century Excel spreadsheet. You have names as the rows, and then the columns are days, and the numbers are the number of pounds that individuals picked. And if you're close enough, you'll see that quite often the numbers are pretty different. What enslaved people found was that the amount that they could pick when they started, when they were pressed all day long and pushed to pick basically without ceasing from dawn to dusk, that number became a requirement that had to be met each day. Each picker had a stint or daily task to perform, Thompson recalled. That is, each of them was required to pick so many pounds of cotton, and when in default, they were unmercifully whipped. Now, Thompson actually was not very good at this, and so he was in danger for a while. But his slave owner found out that Thompson had an amazing memory, had an amazing ability to remember the names and the pounds for any particular weigh-in, at least until the next day had come. So he actually had an innovation that he used Thompson for, which allowed him to sit in the shade for the most part. He would have Thompson and another slave weigh everybody's picking 3 times a day. So in the late morning, in the late afternoon, and then again in the evening. And of course, you can see that this would allow the slave owner even more information about how much people could pick under given circumstances. So Thompson had to perform some feats of mnemonics to remember all the numbers and the names, and certainly an older person in this enslaved labor force would be quite upset if he remembered the name or the number wrong, because it could get them in quite a lot of trouble. But it was the actual cotton pickers who had the harder task, and their task became encoded on sheets like this. Stints or quotas, as I said, were individual. And if Thompson's, if his location was like others, at this slave labor camp where he was, this is not the actual ledger from where he was, it's a representative one from the Natchez area. If it was like others, individual stints or quotas increased over time. Enslaved people like John Brown found that as I picked so well at first, when he was given a 100-pound stint, more was exacted of me, and if I flagged a minute, the whip was liberally applied to keep me up to the mark. By being driven in this way, I at last got to pick 160. And if you think about this increase in the size of the stint for a moment, I believe you'll begin to understand, if you haven't already, many facts of which we historians are still trying to make full sense. Things that never quite made full sense about the process of cotton production. So historians, I think, are still figuring those out, but knowing that the stints increase helps us to do that. For instance, why were enslaved people, why was their labor product weighed every day? Why was it recorded? Why was it ledgered? What did this permit slave owners to do, to learn, to understand? Why were they forced to work all day instead of being given a number to meet as a sort of positive incentive? That happened in some slave systems, but it did not happen by and large in the Cotton South. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you may have wondered why Patsy, who was the fastest picker, was treated so harshly. And it wasn't just because the enslaver there was seeking to have some sort of sexual relationship with her. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that the wife of this slave owner was jealous. If you read Solomon Northup's biography, you can see that she was also pressed and whipped because she did not pick fast enough, and yet she was the fastest picker. In fact, we have records from another location, the Bennett Barrow Plantation, as it's called, in Louisiana, which shows that whether you picked fast or whether you picked slow, you could still be whipped for picking too slow. So whether you habitually hit a high production quota, a low one, or in between, you still faced a whipping if you did not meet your quota. Well, I read Charles Thompson's story about 10 or 12 years ago, and I wasn't trying, I'm just going to bounce back to that too. I wasn't trying to write a history of the role of cotton picking in the development of the slave South in the larger development or the larger process of developing American capitalism. I was trying to write a history of the experience of forced migration in the U.S. South before the Civil War, specifically the domestic slave trade and the forced movement of enslaved African Americans from the older states of the South, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, et cetera, to the newer ones like Mississippi, Florida, Texas, Louisiana. And I was looking through these kinds of documents as well as slave owners' documents to try to figure out what that story and what that experience was like from the inside. And certainly that shapes the book to a great extent. But I kept running into these questions that didn't quite fit together, questions like the ones I just mentioned. And in a topic or maybe a way of looking at things that will be, I hope, familiar to historians and archivists, another question: why were certain kinds of documents created, and why were some kinds of documents more common than the others? When I read histories of slavery in the U.S. South, I often read quite a lot about what slave owners were thinking, what they were feeling, what they thought about slavery, what they didn't think about slavery, what they thought about enslaved people, what they didn't think about enslaved people. But I read very little about them as economic actors. It wasn't that nobody was talking about this, right? But most of what was happening, or most of the discussion, was about a sort of theoretical set of ideas that they might or might not have had about industrialization and the modern world and so on and so forth. And most of that was focused on the late 1850s. But I found, instead of that, I found a lot of records that had to do with cotton picking, specifically these kinds of ledgers. These are among the most common, page for page, these are among the most common documents in the history of the South and the historical archives of slave owners or former slave owners. And I found lots of records that had to do with banks and borrowing and buying and selling of slaves, of course, but also the buying and the selling of the credit, if you will, that allowed slave owners to buy and sell slaves. And all of this ultimately pointed me, through my reading of other histories and through my reading of these documents, to the conclusion that what we're looking at when we look at the slave South is not the only origin point, but one of the key origin points of the modern world in which we live. And let me see if I can tie the pieces of that together a little bit. And I think this requires us to step back to the chronological frontier in the broadest sense on which Charles Thompson was born. And this is an overambitious illustration by an economist named Gregory Clark, who does really interesting and controversial work. It's an attempt to portray all of human history in one picture. And the argument that Clark makes, and I think it's consistent with the work of a lot of other historians and economists in many ways, is that for most of human history, since the invention of agriculture anyway, about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago, many societies, if not all societies, have been essentially in a sort of Malthusian cycle of advance and retreat, of growing to a size that's the sort of maximum supportable size given a certain set of technologies and a certain number of resources. And thus we have the expansion and then the contraction of, certainly in Chinese history, according to Kenneth Pomerantz, another historian, this happens repeatedly, and we see this in European history as well. The proponents of this theory would argue. It's only between 1750 and 1850 that we see human societies break out of this cycle, for good or for ill, and start to produce much more than the number of mouths that one has to feed can consume. And in fact, to do so with a sufficient number of technological advances, a sufficient increase in efficiency of production that more can be invested in other areas of economic activity, including the expansion of the efficiency of production still more. And thus we get the sort of recurring cycles of growth, some would argue, in the history of capitalism and of the Western world, and increasingly of the globe since 1750. And it's this key point when growth rates, when income rates for most people in Western societies, not necessarily for enslaved people, when they take off between 1750 and 1850, that we have to look at if we want to explain why this transformation happens, at least why it happens the first particular time. It's that point in history that we have to understand. We have to understand how this transformation happened. And on one level, this is the story of modernization and modernity. These are the key questions, or some of the key questions, that history, economics, and numerous other disciplines were invented to explain, and this created the world that they then continue to explain. This is also the great divergence that finally ensured that the West would dominate the rest, at least until Asia could move once again to economic prominence in the world, as we've seen over the last 50 years. And there have been a host of explanations offered for this historical shift. Some argue that it's a series of crucial key inventions in technology, and clearly that's part of this story, although technologies have been invented time and time again, sometimes the same technologies over and over again. Some would argue that it's the existence of private property as a cultural and legal force in some way that's particular to the West that leads to capitalism. Some would argue that it's a particular cultural capacity for inventiveness that is supposedly found in the West that leads to this kind of transformation. Some would argue that it is government policy and particular kinds of investments, legal changes, etc., move away from feudal or mercantile structures of governance that lead to the rise of capitalism. Now, not only economists, but most white historians have routinely rejected, often with, I think I would have to say, ill grace, the Eric Williams thesis, which held that British gains from the Atlantic slave trade helped lead to industrialization. And in fact, Kenneth Pomerantz brings that argument back, and he says, in fact, we need to think of the Caribbean and the U.S. South as the ghost acres, which are contributed to the overall economic growth and economic resources that the West has to draw upon. And I tend to favor that explanation, but I didn't know I was going to try to contribute to the explanation of that macro-historical question when I started this process of research. As I explained, I thought I was writing about something else, but I kept finding these other sources which pointed me back to questions of productivity, efficiency, and the question of why enslavers were so interested in credit and why they were so interested in the picking of cotton. Well, let's talk about cotton for just a second, and I'll try to point you to where I went with this. Demand for raw cotton grew exponentially between 1800 and 1860 as the global economy's taste for cotton drove a massive growth in textile factory systems, but production in the U.S. grew even faster than demand. By 1860, this brought the real price of cotton to 25% of its real price per pound in 1800. So it drops to a quarter of what it had been. U.S. producers generated by 1860 88% of the cotton sold in the world's central markets. U.S. production of cotton had increased something like 650 times over, even as the number of enslaved people picking it, pushing through that production bottleneck, had increased only 40 times over. But how did that happen? It was only when I started to listen to Charles Thompson and other survivors of slavery that I found the key that unlocked the puzzle. Because survivors' testimonies, plus the cotton picking spreadsheets, plus the total numbers, plus numerous pieces of enslavers' testimony, revealed that those enslavers had created a diabolical system that's actually more clearly depicted in the film 12 Years a Slave than by and large by professional historians. In this system, slave owners assigned individual picking quotas, weighed each bag at the end of the day or sometimes during the middle of the day, wrote down the total, and whipped each person who failed to meet their particular quota. When an individual figured out how to meet the quota was raised again and again and again. And I started to create a series of observations. And I was sort of beat to the punch by a set of economists who had a whole team of research assistants who were doing this as well. And they found in even more detail what I was finding, which is that the rate of picking increased 4 times over from 1800 to 1860. And by the way, so this is a 400% increase in the efficiency of cotton picking. This is a bottleneck in the system. In factories over the same time period, in English factories, the labor efficiency, aided by machines, the labor efficiency of workers increases in spinning between 400 and 600 or so percent, and weaving between 600 and 1,000%. So slightly more, but it's on the same order of magnitude, right? And this helps to explain why enslaved people supplied so much cotton that they drove down the price even as supply was increasing dramatically. Now, low-priced, abundant raw materials had some pretty important consequences. This allowed factory owners in Britain and Massachusetts to invest the cost savings generated by what I would describe as calibrated torture in ever more efficient machines. And consumers around the world benefited from the cheaper cloth that factories pumped out. And as I said, I'll come back to this one, but this is cotton on the New Orleans levee. But I wanted to make the point that consumers were benefiting so much from the ever cheaper cloth that the system of fashion, as we know it today, grows in no small part as a solution to the problem of cotton oversupply created by the whip-driven efficiency of enslaved African-American stolen labor. Literally, it's in many ways analogous to the U.S. government's by now well-chronicled attempts to get us to consume more corn, right? People have to be convinced to consume cotton in greater and greater quantities. So that's a big part of the story of the book. There are other stories. There's stories about survival. There's stories about resistance. And that's also a crucial part. But certainly this particular story, this story which is at the heart of the development of modern capitalism, the world we live in today, in fact, is something that has certainly gotten a lot of attention. And I think that's fine because I think it's a crucial topic. And there's more to say about it for sure. But certainly one of the goals of the book was to reveal as best I could the ways in which the forced migration of enslaved African Americans was a driving force in the history of the U.S. And I think what we can say is that a 400% system-wide increase in the efficiency of production of the world's most important commodity must be described as a pretty important increase in efficiency. And anything else would be special pleading on behalf of the increasingly untenable claim that slavery hindered rather than helped the rise of British and American capitalism to dominance over the global economy. And in fact, the market marked this unusual efficiency by flocking to American producers of cotton, which by the 1830s are driving out the older cotton-producing regions of the world. They're driving them off the world market and sort of pinning them into domestic consumption, like the Indian cotton sector, which is free people are picking the cotton there. Now, some people find it unlikely that the intensity of labor and various labor management processes, if we want to use that euphemism for what happened in the cotton fields, that this could lead to a 4-fold increase of productivity in 60 years. And some people have said, well, that's just not possible. And certainly, I'm sure that there are other parts of the story we could tell. Certainly, seeds are probably part of the story. Certainly, new land is part of the story. But slave owners are mostly focused on getting people to pick cotton faster, and they create a huge amount of documentation to show themselves doing that and show themselves whether or not they're being successful at doing that. And as to the question of whether or not it's possible to increase the efficiency of hand labor by hard driving, measurement, et cetera, by 400% over 60 years, you could consider this. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the originator of so-called scientific management, and his team of stopwatch-wielding assistants claimed that they could increase the productivity of these guys who are carrying pig iron from point A to point B in a railroad yard. They claimed they could increase that 4 times over in a week. And they may have overstated their claims, but the whole field of management studies might beg to differ with the claim that we cannot improve work output by changing incentives. In fact, there are quite a lot of people who are working on that right now. But there are a lot of reasons, in other words, why the half of the story that's about efficiency, productivity, and capitalism's history get a lot of attention right now. Just think about the implications of the fact that the efficiency of cotton picking grew by 2% per year for what may have been the most crucial 60 years of Western society's transition from subsistence agricultural to high-growth modern economics. We like to think that the industrialization that lifted the Western world from rural backwardness to ever-improving standards of living was produced by clever inventors, factory workers, and captains of industry. But American cotton made by slaves was the key raw material of British and American factories, which mostly made textiles. Millions of people were moved to slavery's frontiers, and like the ones measured by Charles Thompson, they were driven to produce that cotton ever more cheaply. As I said, the plummeting price of cotton enabled investments and accumulations of wealth that went far beyond the cotton fields and the mansions that, in some cases, rose up next to them. In fact, they led to the accumulation of concentrations of wealth that in one form or another are still with us. They're like those first crucial years of savings and a retirement portfolio, but in this case, for an entire society. A refusal to admit the contribution of slavery to this growth is long-standing because that connection has political and intellectual implications. Intellectually, a long-term, highly consequential increase in the productivity of enslaved labor implies that capitalism and freedom do not inevitably go hand in hand, that a rising tide might not only not lift all the boats, but that the water level might be rising because of all the bodies being drowned in it. Politically, it's not a surprise that the question of reparations for slavery often comes up when I make this argument. Although the book doesn't consciously advocate any particular policy or anything like that, if I am correct about the essential role of continuously innovated, intensified, more efficient labor in enabling and sustaining the cascading effects of economic modernization, we are all living off wealth that perhaps could only have been created by slavery, and certainly in this particular world was created in large part by slavery, although of course some of us are much more able to access that wealth than others. I'd like to close with a story and a question. And the story is one told by a man named Henry Clay, who was interviewed in the 1930s. He was named after somebody who almost became president several times. But this particular Henry Clay was born into slavery in North Carolina, moved by his enslaver to Louisiana, where he worked in the cotton fields, picking, cultivating cotton, and so on. And he was asked by his interviewer, he was asked some questions about his former slave owner, and he said something to the effect that this was a very clever man. Well, why was he clever? What was clever about him? Well, he had some interesting ideas, some inventions. Well, what was one invention he had? He had something called a whipping machine, Henry Clay said. All right, this was a machine where if somebody wasn't working very well, if they were picking too slow, for instance, you'd bring them in, you'd tie them down on a wooden bench, and that was part of the machine. And over the bench was suspended a wheel that was connected by a system of pulleys to a foot pedal. When you pumped the pedal, the wheel turned, and attached to the wheel was a series of long leather straps. And when it turned, it thrashed the back of the person on the bench into bloody, blistered jelly. And he said, you know, we worked very hard when we saw that. And I don't know if this was a real thing. I don't know if it was an actual invention, actual contraption that some clever enslaver made, or if it was in fact a gigantic metaphor. Because in many ways it is an effective metaphor for a system that really attains the level of a technology of measurement, of creating negative and positive, but above all negative incentives, of continuously raising the efficiency of production. It's not a machine, it's not something as small and as localized as one whipping machine, but you could say the entire Cotton South was, in that sense, one big whipping machine. And it is very different from the way most of us work, but I think it has an effect. It has an effect on us, however distant or direct you may think that effect is. Because the assumption that efficiency should trump everything else, such as the right to not be tied down on a bench and whipped, was in fact generated and sustained and expanded back in the glory days of American slavery's expansion. It still expresses the core value that emerged not only from techniques in the slave fields, but also from most non-slaveholding white Americans' willingness to let 4 million people like Patsy or Henry Clay or Charles Thompson endure any kind of management which enabled then unprecedented economic growth to continue. That was the assumption that efficiency, making more stuff in less time with fewer laborers, that was the value that trumped all other considerations about how people could and should be treated. Even those who argued against slavery often argued that it was bad because it was supposedly less efficient than free wage labor. And so perhaps you see the trap that we've been left in ever since. So committed are some to the idea that capitalism must always lead to both freedom and efficiency, that defenses of the idea often refuse to actually grapple with the actual facts of slavery's expansion in the U.S. The whipping machine metaphor, I think, helps us to see how productivity has moved from possibility to actualization on at least a metaphorical level. And on other levels, we can find that story clearly detailed in the records of those who survived. But my question is always whether we want to face this story. And I think facing the story gives us some truths that if we can face it and face its effects on our lives today, that perhaps could go some way towards setting us free. Because I don't think we are as free as we would be, even if we are nominally free, if slavery had not existed. Certainly we derive many, many benefits from that history. But look around, and I'm not saying that people today work in the United States under conditions of slavery typically, but everywhere from Jiffy Lube to Amazon warehouses to grocery checkouts, we find not only technology, but time and motion management increasing productivity by providing structures and incentives which demand that humans move their bodies faster, with fewer pauses, with greater skill and accuracy and precision, and the end of this process is unclear. Look at the intensification of labor among even professionals like doctors, lawyers, and stockbrokers, driven simply by imposing new expectations and standards, positive and negative. Look at your own lives. Many of you in this room, I'm talking to you, answering email at 11 p.m. or 6 a.m., all right? Creating content for Facebook and Twitter. Open your eyes. You're also paying for the slaveholder's success in your own small way. Thank you. Okay, do we have questions?
15 minutes for questions, and we're asking to use a microphone just so we can pick up the question.
Yes, thank you. Could you reflect a little bit on the relationship between the production of the cotton in the South and the processing of it in the North, and how intimate that relationship and widespread? Any of that cotton also went directly to Europe or processed first? Finally, why they have not tried to get Native American involved in the process?
Great question. So to take what I think was the second question, the vast majority of cotton grown in the American South goes to Britain and Europe more generally, something like 80% of all of it, even as late as 1860. But 20% of it, more or less by 1860, stays in the U.S. to feed a growing textile industry here. So that textile industry is really the first industry in the U.S., as it was in most places that have experienced industrial revolution, was really the first factory system. And it springs up gradually, but by the 1820s, it's particularly strong, obviously, in New England, in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, and so on. And this is very significant because first of all, that textile industry is made possible by a policy alliance between northern representatives and southern ones. An agreement that we're going to have certain kinds of tariffs, right, that will, for instance, protect a market in the U.S. South for the lower technology, the lower quality cloth that is all that U.S. mills can produce. But at the same time, that market for raw cotton is going to remain entirely devoted to southern producers. They could have outcompeted others anyway. But what's more important to them is that enables southern cotton producers to have a political alliance with a significantly larger number of northern politicians that we usually recognize. So when we ask, how was slavery able to continue and expand and so on, it's because for most of American history, most of the years after independence, there was pretty strong support among not only Southerners but also Northern whites for at least some degree of expansion, and certainly for its survival. So what's also significant about that development of Northern industry is that the cotton industry leads to other industries in the North in all kinds of ways. It leads to a market for commercial agriculture, first in New England, later in in Pennsylvania and New York and so on, because textile workers have to be fed, right? This is a sort of classic account of industrialization that then produces all kinds of knock-on effects. And after that, after the textile industry has been growing for a while, northern industry starts to diversify into other kinds of industries like the tool and machine making, eventually the locomotive manufacturing industry and the iron industry. But many of those have close connections to the textile industry as well. In fact, many of the people who start those industries come out of the textile industry. So cotton is there at first, second, third, or even fourth hand. So it's very significant. And I think there was one other question you asked that I don't think I answered.
The relationship to Europe and the Native Americans.
Yeah. So, one of the enduring questions of American slavery is why Native people were not enslaved on a large scale. And actually, we're finding out that they were enslaved on a large scale in the U.S., what becomes the U.S., but in the late 17th, early 18th century. And that system disappears to a large extent because most of the enslaved natives die or escape as a sort of general rule. We can certainly find exceptions. But actually, what we find in the U.S. South and the states that become the Cotton Belt is that those native leaders who adopt slavery and cotton growing end up aligning their interests to a large extent with the whites, and often are the political leaders who signed the treaties, right? Whether they had any choice or not is a different question, but they signed the treaties which then allow the U.S. government to move the vast majority of native peoples out of Alabama and Mississippi and Florida and so on. So in a different way, slavery becomes a kind of fulcrum or wedge that breaks apart Native American society in the Southwest.
Is it on? It's on. Gene Rowley here. I'm an ag student a long time ago, 1954 at Cornell, and an MBA in 56. I'm a popular press reader. I'm curious to what extent you looked at the agricultural practices in the growing of the cotton plants, because over 40 to 60 years, plants could have been better cultivars of the plant, closer spacing, fertilizer, all kinds of other reasons that indeed an individual could pick of 4 times the amount of cotton over that period of time.
Yeah. Well, I think it's likely that some of those innovations help to create a greater potential amount of cotton picked by an individual in a day. And certainly there is a significant amount of discussion among slave owners about new agricultural processes. However, they actually out of all the time they spend writing and talking about cotton, at least what ends up in print, there's not too much about the seeds and the picking, because that's not a process that they directly control, right? They know that cotton is picked, but they don't do it themselves. They know what they want. They know what totals they're going to set, and they know how to extract that. So I think their sense of control impels them to spend a lot more time talking about the parts of the production process in their agricultural journals and so on. They're actually less important to their total ultimate amount of revenue. They spend a fair amount of time talking about controlling enslaved people, which is a big part of the way you get more cotton picked. But here's the thing. Other parts of the world had access to these same technologies and techniques. In fact, the British, for instance, are always going to the South, recruiting Southern cotton experts as they see them, buying new Southern cotton gins, acquiring new cultivars, and taking them to the colonies, especially to India. And what they find is they cannot increase the rate of production, the efficiency of labor in India to make its cotton price competitive with American cotton. So Indian cotton is really pretty irrelevant on the world market from about 1820 when it's been closed out by U.S. cotton all the way up until the Civil War, when it becomes relevant again because U.S. cotton is cut off. And then again, after slavery ends, what's pretty clear is that productivity in the South in general, and here we can draw on the work of Robert Fogel, Cornellian as well, ultimately a Nobel Prize winner in economics, who found that individual labor productivity declines by 40% among cotton workers after the Civil War. And there could be many reasons for that, but the seeds and the techniques survive, and in fact, we've got an entire agricultural apparatus that develops to try to enhance the success of cotton planters, which remains the biggest single export for the U.S. up into the late 1890s. But the productivity level clearly drops significantly after slavery is over. So, you know, I think seeds, new cultivars, new techniques are important, but they increase the potential amount that somebody could gather if they were driven full speed. What slave owners are mostly concerned about, it seems to me, is driving them to that full speed to meet that potential.
So would you say the capitalist class created racism to justify slavery, or did they just kind of instrumentalize tribalistic tendencies that were already there? And how are they able to act monolithically as a sort of monolithic agent?
Well, I think the answer to the first one helps us to understand the second one. There's been a lot of great historical writing and thinking about the development of concepts of race, and I think there's probably still more to do. We certainly know in the U.S. that 17th century in Virginia is crucial. That's when slavery becomes explicitly racialized in English-speaking law. In that time period, I think they probably borrow a lot of concepts from the Portuguese and Spanish, but that's when it enters English-speaking law as a concept. That's when it's sort of confirmed in the English-speaking world that the children of enslaved mothers are going to be enslaved. And so what's not true, and is certainly not true in law in 1607, but is true by 1700, is that anybody with visible African descent is assumed, or visible African ancestry is assumed to be a slave, and they have to prove otherwise. And anybody who doesn't look that way and looks to be 100% European in ancestry is assumed to be free. And white status becomes, not surprisingly, a prized possession, and something that even non-slave-holding whites are willing to lay claim to because it gives them certain advantages. And this, in turn, makes it much more possible for slave owners to work together with those who we might think of as sharing different economic interests. And that being said, the interest in the 19th century South of non-slave-owning whites in slavery is also economic, right? It probably establishes in some areas a sort of floor for their wages, but certainly it gives them particular job opportunities like overseeing, which wouldn't have been possible otherwise. It certainly wouldn't have been as profitable. And a well-respected overseer could in a couple of years earn enough to buy one slave, in a couple of years could buy another. This might not seem a lot, but think of it this way. In 1830s and then again in the 1850s, the price of an 18 to 21-year-old young man in New Orleans crosses the $1,000 per person threshold. And if we think about that in terms of what's the inflation-adjusted price, we just put it in a little engine that calculates the inflation rate per year. From the 1830s or 1850s to now is something like, it gives us a figure of something like $60,000 to $70,000. That's quite a lot. But there's other measures that historical economists use to compare price, including the sort of wage rate of labor, which actually is pretty important for this example. It tells us, gives us a sense of how many years of work, right, it would take to acquire a particular piece of property. And $1,000 for a slave in that particular algorithm works out to about $220,000 to $250,000 in 2016 dollars. So in other words, about the same price as a single-family home, and a sort of similar target as not just a sort of a useful commodity to own, but a store of wealth, as a target for savings and so on and so forth, and as something that you can leverage into even greater economic opportunities. So not everybody becomes a slave owner, but as a target, as a sort of focus of the economic system, you can see that it's compelling for those actors in it who are free and white, and particularly male, but women were also part of this too. And you can see how it helps to support a system, and how Southern non-slave owners in particular would be very reluctant to see the kind of instability in the system, not just the sort of racialized system of power, right, but also the economic system of power that racialization permits. And so this helps to explain, I think, why they were willing to fight in the Civil War as well as slave owners.
One more question?
Yes, my question.
Okay. I see a couple of hands.
Given your work, do you have any particular position on reparations for African Americans now in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and I think as a question of justice, given that not only that there were centuries of stolen labor, but then ever since 1865, there have been numerous government policies implemented to prevent emancipated African Americans and their descendants from having full access to that. I think that there's a claim in justice to be made. And reparations, of course, are something that our society has done in various forms, in various ways, but not for slavery, not for Jim Crow. That being said, the question is always, how would this work? And there actually are a number of theories, a number of ideas that are out there. The economist Sandy Darity at Duke has a proposal for a set of government-supported bonds that would be given, in fact, to virtually any family in the U.S. Where the family wealth doesn't meet a certain threshold. And this would sweep up the vast majority of African Americans, but certainly some other people as well. And these bonds would be issued at birth. They would be held to 18 or 21. They could only be used for certain purposes, paying for college, buying a home, starting a business, et cetera. So that's one possible thing. The other thing, and this doesn't apply directly to Cornell, so I'm not going to get in the same trouble I would get at Princeton or Harvard or something like that for saying this. But most of our universities, most of our historically white universities in this country that were founded before 1861 have deep, deep ties to slavery. And one of the most shocking moments, which wasn't shocking and yet it was shocking, right? You knew it, but you hadn't come face to face with it, was finding in the archives the record. These were folders of letters from a North Carolina family. This is the 1820s. Finding a record in which a woman is donating a slave to the University of North Carolina, which of course is the great planter-based state university of my home state. And this was, of course, not the only time. And of course, you think about donating a person who could be worth up to $1,000 and how that wealth accumulated and built over time. I'm an alum of Georgetown, and it's just been trying to come to grips with the fact that tens of thousands of dollars worth of human beings were sold to keep the university afloat in the late 1830s. The university would not exist without this addition, which is one way or another surely part of its endowment. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done at universities, and conversely, there's a lot of work that could be done in supporting Hbcus, which have been systematically underfunded, denied access to what historically white universities have had access to over the years. And in fact, A significant number of HBCUs are founded by freed people, sort of in the process of freedom itself. Virginia Union was literally founded at an old slave trader's yard, which had been taken over by freed people. Thousands of people had been sold from that yard in Richmond and taken down to New Orleans. And in 1865, when the Union Army comes, freed people take it over and they start a school there, which eventually becomes Virginia Union University, one of the most underfunded universities in the entire country. If that university doesn't represent American values, I do not know what university does. And we could make the same case for virtually any HBCU. So I think there's a lot of work that both that federal and state governments could do, but also that historically white universities could do to try to transform the opportunities for education, for wealth accumulation, and for access that have been systematically denied to enslaved people, to people who achieve emancipation, and to their descendants over the years.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you.